There is a particular quality to silence that only the dead can manufacture. Not the silence of empty rooms or unoccupied corridors. Those silences carry the residual warmth of human presence, the faint thermal signature of breath recently departed. The silence I am speaking of is older. It has weight, density. It is the silence of stone that has not heard a voice in 60 million years, stone that has forgotten the concept of sound and ceased, at some deep geological level of awareness, to expect it. That was the silence of Varanthos 4. I stood at the primary ingress shaft, a wound drilled through 300 meters of bedrock by Mechanicus servitors who had since been recalled, their work classified at the highest possible tier and their memories selectively excised. Before me, the shaft descended into absolute darkness, perfectly circular, the walls unnaturally smooth, not with the smoothness of grinding tools but with the smoothness of material that had never quite belonged to this planet. Stone imported from somewhere deeper in the universe's history, pressed and fitted into permanence by hands that no longer existed in minds that had long since poured themselves into metal. My name is Malchin Vane, Shield Captain of the Adeptus Custodes, Fourth Brotherhood. I have served the Emperor for 473 years, and in that time I have walked across worlds that wept fire, stood in chambers where gods once breathed, and killed things that were never meant to die. I tell you this not to establish authority. Authority requires an audience willing to grant it, and the things I faced in Varanthos 4 were not willing to grant anything. I tell you this so that when I describe what I felt standing at that shaft's edge, you may understand the measure of it. I felt small. Not physically. My Auramite armor stood nearly 3 meters tall, its alloys refined over decades in the Emperor's own forges on Terra, its surface engraved in high Gothic script with the record of 800 individual acts of service. My guardian spear rested at my shoulder with the casual authority of a weapon that had ended demons, traitors, and xenos of a dozen species. By every empirical measure, I was among the most formidable organisms currently alive. But the darkness below me was not empirical. It was older than measurement. The mission brief had arrived directly from the Terran Vault, sealed with 3 authentication ciphers and the Captain General's personal mark. 3 pages of operational parameters and a single sentence of context, as if context were a luxury. Venerable Brother Sathachos of the Sable Eternals, Contemptor Pattern Dreadnought, missing in action since 998.m40, has resumed transmission from within the Varanthos 4 subsurface complex. Recover asset if viable. Silence if necessary. 3 centuries. Sathachos had been inside this tomb for 3 centuries. The Sable Eternals had struck Varanthos 4 in 998.m40, 47 Astartes and their support elements, a precise and ambitious kill team dispatched to harvest Necronter artifacts from the outer archive chambers before the dormant tomb's defense systems could fully initialize. They had succeeded partially. 44 Astartes had extracted. 3 had not, and among the 3 was Sathachos, the chapter's most ancient warrior, interred in his Dreadnought chassis for over 600 years before Varanthos, a figure of legend even among the Adeptus Astartes. He had held the withdrawal corridor. He had been sealed inside when the tomb sealed itself. The Sable Eternals had classified it as a strategic withdrawal. They had conducted memorials, filed casualty reports, and moved on. That is what warriors do with shame that cannot be recovered. They institutionalize it and move forward. The signal had made institutionalization impossible. 3 weeks ago, the Mechanicus monitoring station on Varanthos 7, a frozen outer world of the same system, had flagged an anomalous transmission. Encrypted. Fragmentary. Cycling through Imperial hymn codes that had not been active since the late 40th millennium. The distress beacon of Sathachos, carrier wave still functional, awakened by causes unknown, broadcasting upward through 60 million years of Necronter stone. We had been dispatched before the signal analysis was 48 hours old. I looked at my team, Custodian Erevan at my left shoulder, posture radiating the precise calm of a man who had learned to use dread as a compass bearing. Custodian Sentinel Pyralis behind him, record of service longer than most chapters' recorded histories. Havelock, Soren, and the veteran called only the Pale, arranged in practice spacing, weapons ready, visors already deep in low-light adaptation. 6 custodians, against whatever 3 centuries had built inside. It is enough, I told myself. I say told and not believed. There is a distinction, and honesty, which is the only thing I have left to offer this account, demands I preserve it. I stepped into the shaft. The darkness received me without ceremony. The walls slid past in silence. Within 40 meters, the drill servitor scratches disappeared entirely, swallowed by the original Necronter surface. A surface so perfectly executed it seemed less like stonework and more like a philosophical argument about what stone could be if freed from geological compromise. The temperature dropped 6 degrees per 10 meters of descent. My armor compensated. My mind did not. At 300 meters, the shaft ended. The tomb of Varanthos opened before us. Vaulted ceilings that rose beyond the reach of my helm's illumination. Corridors extending in geometric perfection toward darkness that consumed distance without apology. The architecture was not impressive in the manner of Imperial architecture, which communicates scale as a declaration of institutional power. Necronter architecture communicates permanence. The difference is not merely aesthetic. One says, "Behold what we have built." The other says, "This will remain when all builders are forgotten." I had one moment of stillness. Then, from somewhere impossibly deep in the tomb's geography, the sound reached me. A hymn, broken, looping, grinding through the harmonics of a vox unit never designed for singing, cycling through the same 4 bars of an imperial processional march that had been old when the Horus heresy was young. Sathachos was still singing. We did not rush. That requires emphasis because in the lexicon of military decision-making, the discovery of a living signal in hostile territory typically generates urgency, and urgency generates pace, and pace generates the specific category of fatal errors that field commanders spend careers cataloging and mourning. I had seen rushed entries destroy better teams than mine. I had seen well-armored men die quickly in environments they had not allowed themselves to understand. I had no intention of dying quickly in a place this old. The tomb's outer corridor extended for approximately 400 meters before branching at a junction whose geometry I recognized from Mechanicus projections of similar Necron structures. A tripartite split, each branch descending at a different gradient, each one leading toward the deeper archive tiers that the Sable Eternals had never reached. The walls on either side were not empty. They were occupied. I used that word with deliberate precision. The niches were carved at regular intervals, perhaps every 3 meters, and within each niche stood a Necron warrior in full stasis arrest. They were not alive. They were not dead. They existed in the precise condition that Necron biology had been engineered to sustain indefinitely, a metabolic suspension so complete that the only indication of any internal process was the faint, intermittent phosphorescence in their eye lenses, green and cold as deep ocean bioluminescence, cycling on intervals too slow to register as rhythm unless you stood watching for several minutes. I stood and watched for several minutes. This is something that distinguishes the custodians from the Adeptus Astartes, and I do not say it with superiority. The Astartes are magnificent instruments, and the Emperor's design for them was brilliant within its operational parameters. But the Astartes are built for war at a tempo measured in seconds. Custodians are built for service measured in centuries, which requires a different relationship with patience. We observe. We assess. We carry the conclusions of our observations forward into action rather than substituting action for observation. What I observed. The warriors in the niches were stirring. Not awakening, not yet. The stirring was subthreshold, a tectonic level shift in the tempo of their internal cycling. Their eye lenses had increased phosphorescent output by perhaps 12% since my arrival at the junction. The microtremors in their facial musculature, if musculature was even the appropriate term for living metal that responded to encoded neural signals, had increased in frequency. The tomb around us was conducting a diagnostic. Not on us. On itself. Something had prompted that diagnostic before we ever descended the shaft. Something had already disturbed this place. Sathachos. I had been briefed on contemptor-pattern dreadnoughts before my departure, though the briefing had been redundant for someone of my tenure. I had encountered them before, never in this context, but I understood what they were in the fullest philosophical sense, which is different from understanding their mechanical specifications. A dreadnought is not a war machine operated by a warrior. It is a warrior, continued. The biological body of a space marine, already among the most extensively modified organisms in human history, destroyed or rendered terminally incapable of sustaining itself, and the remaining consciousness, the accumulated personality and memory and will of that warrior, transferred into an armored chassis designed for indefinite service. Indefinite service. I had spent 473 years in the service of the Emperor, and I understood, on a cellular level, the weight of that commitment. But I had chosen it. Or I had been shaped to choose it in ways I did not fully examine, because examination of one's foundational choices is a luxury reserved for beings whose foundational choices are mutable. Mine were not. Sithachos had not chosen the tomb. That distinction was the first crack in what I had arrived believing was a straightforward mission. I was aware of the crack immediately, and I made a deliberate decision to examine it later, to file it in the category of cognitive material that required processing at a time when processing would not compromise operational effectiveness. I was experienced enough to know that the filing would not hold indefinitely. The crack would insist on expansion. But I needed it to wait. We moved deeper. The hymn grew clearer as we descended, though clearer is perhaps not the correct word. More present. More real. It was still fragmented, the same passage cycling repeatedly, breaking at the same points, resuming from the same bar with the same grinding hesitation, as though the mechanism producing it was caught in a loop it could not identify and could not exit. An imperial march. I recognized it, the processional of undying valor, composed in the 31st millennium in honor of the warriors who had held the Eternity Gate during the Siege of Terra. It had been written for the dead. The bitter symmetry of hearing it here, in a tomb not of the Imperium's making, performed by a dead man who did not know he was singing, did not escape me. At the junction, I chose the left branch. The signal was strongest from that direction, not by much, perhaps a 4% differential in carrier strength, but in the absence of superior intelligence, 4% is conviction enough. We descended. The corridor grew warmer as it went deeper, which was counterintuitive until I remembered that Necron tombs are not passive structures. They are active ones, sustained by energy systems of extraordinary sophistication, systems whose heat signatures increase as the dormancy protocols cycle toward full activation. The tomb was warming because it was waking. Not completely. Not yet. But the threshold was being approached with the slow inevitability of geological process, a force that does not hurry because it does not need to. At the 2-kilometer mark, we found the first evidence of Sithachos. A Canoptech Wraith, one of the sinuous maintenance constructs that Necron tomb complexes deployed for both repair and internal security, lay in 3 distinct pieces across the corridor floor. Its living metal components were already engaged in the slow, extraordinary process of repair, the fractured edges creeping toward one another with the patient determination of a wound trying to close. But the initial damage had been severe. Whatever had done it had possessed enormous kinetic force, delivered with precision, and had not stopped to verify the kill. Beside the dismembered wraith, burned into the corridor wall at approximately 2 meters height, was a mark in Imperial Gothic. A single word, scorched by some weapon's discharge into Necronter metal that had never been meant to bear human script. Fighting. 300 years of solitude, and the message Sithachos had left for whoever might come, if anyone ever came, was not a plea, not a lament. One word. A declaration of continued operational status. A report from a warrior too ancient and too broken to know the war had long since moved elsewhere. I stood before that word for a long time. Erevan said nothing. None of them said anything. That was one of the qualities I valued most in my team. They understood when silence was the correct response to the universe, and they honored it without requiring instruction. Finally, I committed the word to memory and moved on. The trail Sithachos had left through the tomb was not subtle. It could not have been. A contemptor pattern Dreadnought stands 4.5 meters at full height and masses somewhere in the range of 18 tons, and it had been navigating these corridors for 300 years with a single operational priority: forward engagement. The evidence of its passage was written in the walls, the floors, the accumulated wreckage of constructs destroyed and corridors scorched and niches blasted open where Necron warriors had presumably attempted to intercept and been dismantled for the effort. But the walls were healing. That was the detail that anchored something cold in my chest. The walls were healing. Living metal does not merely resist damage, it reverses it, given sufficient time and sufficient systemic support. 3 centuries of Sithachos's war, had been conducted against a medium that could recover from everything he inflicted upon it. Every warrior he destroyed had eventually reconstructed. Every corridor he burned had eventually cooled and restored itself. Every marker he carved into the walls, and there were many, scratched with weapons or servo claws, distances and directions and names I did not recognize, had been slowly consumed by the regenerative processes of the Necronter stone. He had been fighting a war he could never win, against an enemy he could never permanently defeat, in a fortress that erased his victories as quickly as he achieved them. 3 centuries. No victories that lasted. No damage that held. I found I could not process the full implications of that immediately. I noted them, filed them, and continued forward, which is what the mission required and what my training dictated. But the filing was becoming increasingly precarious. The cracks were multiplying. At the 3-kilometer mark, the tomb changed character. The outer corridors had been orderly, the product of a single design intelligence with consistent aesthetic and structural priorities. At the 3-kilometer threshold, we entered what the Mechanicus projections had designated the inner archive tier, and the architecture shifted in ways that I have difficulty translating into language adequate to the experience. The corridors became chambers. The chambers became galleries. The galleries contained structures I recognized as sarcophagi, not in the funerary sense that human cultures meant when they used that word, but in the Necron engineering sense. The burial capsules of dormant warriors, arranged in ranks that extended beyond visual range, tier upon tier ascending into heights that once again outpaced my helm's illumination. Thousands of them, the warrior population of a dynasty, compressed into perfect preservation, waiting with 60-million-year patience for the signal that would bring them back into operation. The signal was coming. I could measure the tomb's activation progression in real time through my armor sensory arrays. The phosphorescent output of the nearest stasis capsules had increased 28% since our descent began. The ambient temperature had risen 3 degrees. Subtle vibrations passed through the floor at irregular intervals, not the vibrations of geological settling or structural stress, but the vibrations of distant machinery cycling to readiness, power conduits charging, processes initializing that had been suspended since before humanity's first ancestor stood upright on the plains of Terra. Sithachos' signal had done what 3 centuries of his physical presence had apparently not. It had reached a frequency, an amplitude, a precise combination of electromagnetic characteristics that crossed the activation threshold of the tomb's primary sensory architecture. His broadcasting had been unintentional, which made it somehow worse than deliberate intrusion. He had not meant to wake them. He had simply been unable to stop singing. Pyralis moved up beside me without prompting. His voice came through our sealed tactical channel, low, even the professional calm of a man filing an operational note. Activation index is increasing faster than projected. The outer models assumed weeks. This feels like days. Hours, I said. A pause. Do you want to expedite the approach? I considered it. The argument for speed was straightforward. Every additional minute we spent in the tomb was a minute the tomb spent approaching full operational capacity, and a fully operational Necron tomb with 6 custodians inside it was a problem with a known solution, the kind of solution that leaves no survivors to file reports. The argument against speed was equally straightforward. Rushing toward a half-mad dreadnought in hostile architecture designed specifically to disorient and attrite intruders was the kind of decision that turned recoverable situations into catastrophic ones. Maintain pace, I said. Eyes on all surfaces. The next kilometer brought 3 separate encounters with Necron constructs. Not warriors, not yet, though the warriors in their capsules were beginning to exhibit synchronized eye-lens activity, which was the pre-awakening behavior pattern the intelligence profiles had identified as critical threshold indicator. What emerged to intercept us were canoptek scarabs, the smallest of the tomb's automated maintenance organisms, typically deployed in large clusters for salvage and repair operations, occasionally repurposed as security instruments by tomb architectures that had been compromised or damaged. These ones had been in contact with Sithachos. I could tell because they were fragmented. Not destroyed, canoptek scarabs are engineered with the same self-repair capacity as every other element of Necronter living metal, but fragmentary, their locomotion irregular, their behavioral algorithms visibly disrupted by whatever had been done to them. They moved toward us in small groups of 3 and 4, and they died under our weapons quickly and without tactical complexity. But they had not attacked us with any particular coordination or ferocity. They had simply moved toward us in the way that a damaged machine executes its last valid instruction, because the instruction is all that remains. The damage to them was recent. Within the last several hours, Sithachos was still active in this tier, still fighting, still moving. The hymn had grown clearer still, and I could now parse its damaged lyrics well enough to confirm the identification. The fourth verse of the Processional of Undying Valor, the verse traditionally sung at the interment ceremony of fallen Astartes heroes. The verse that begins, "Lay not down your burden, brother, for the Emperor's work has no appointed hour of rest." In the context of everything I was observing, those words sat in my chest like cooling shrapnel. Then we heard something else. Behind the hymn, layered beneath it, a sound of entirely different provenance. Not mechanical, not imperial, a resonance, deep and structured, emanating from the floor and walls simultaneously, rising through the stone with the character of a chord struck on an instrument of incomprehensible scale. The tomb's communication architecture, the internal signal network by which Necron command-grade entities propagated orders to their legions, had activated. Something was aware. Something was awake. Not a warrior. Not a construct. Something that ranked above them. Erevan's voice came through the channel. Flat. Controlled. Command-grade activation. "I hear it," I said. "Do we continue?" I looked at the wall beside me. Another mark was there, fresher than the others, scorched within days rather than decades. The letters precise despite the trembling that had clearly afflicted whatever limb had made them. Not a word this time. 2 words. They woke. I took one long breath. "We continue." We found him at the 4-kilometer mark, in a gallery so vast it defied the physics of its own existence. A chamber that had no architectural right to be as large as it was, its ceiling lost in darkness 300 meters overhead, its floor a grid of dormant sarcophagi stretching in every direction to walls I could not see, every capsule occupied, every capsule trembling now with sub-threshold activity, the entire space suffused with a green luminescence that was brightening degree by degree as we stood watching. Sithachos stood in the center of the gallery. He was magnificent and terrible in the same moment, which is the only honest way to describe a thing whose dignity and its devastation are inseparable. 3.5 centuries had not diminished his physical scale. The Contemptor chassis was intact in its fundamental architecture, the massive carapace still bearing the heraldry of the Sable Eternals in colors that had faded to ghosts of themselves but remained legible. The twin lost cannons mounted on his left arm still oriented forward, still operational, the combat fist on his right arm stained dark with 300 years of continuous use. He stood 4.5 meters tall in the center of the gallery floor, and the space around him was a circumference of destruction. Shattered constructs in every state of reassembly, scorch marks that layered over older scorch marks in sedimentary strata that recorded decades of the same fight in the same place. He was engaged. Not with us. He had not registered our presence. He was engaged with 3 canoptech wraiths that circled him in the drifting, semi-translucent fashion of their kind, their forms flickering between dimensional states as they attempted to identify approach vectors around the Dreadnought's defensive awareness. And Sithachos tracked them. His chassis rotated with surprising fluidity. The engineering of the Contemptor design had been produced by minds that understood articulation in ways that later Dreadnought marks never quite recaptured. His lost cannon arm rising to lead one of the wraiths as it shifted position, his combat fist oriented toward the floor where a second wraith had sunk partially into the stone. He was singing the whole time, the processional unchanged, the 4th verse cycling, the grinding of his vox unit audible even at 50 meters, cycling through the same harmonic breakdown at the same interval in the same bar, a mechanical repetition so precise it had ceased to be a performance and become a symptom, a system error that could not correct itself. A voice that had been singing for so long it had forgotten the categories of beginning and ending. I raised my right fist. My team halted. I stood and I watched Sithachos for a long time. The wraiths were not attacking with full commitment. This was the detail that my tactical mind identified first, and it was a detail that refused to resolve itself into a simple explanation. Necron canoptech wraiths in full operational mode are extraordinarily capable combatants, sufficiently capable to threaten even a custodian with serious injury. They had the speed, the dimensional shift capability, and the cutting appendages to prosecute an attack against a single dreadnought with real effectiveness. But these three were circling, testing, probing at intervals and withdrawing, as though following an algorithm that had been modified from destroy to something that translated as contain. Or perhaps, more precisely, observe. They were studying him. 300 years of studying him. I lowered my fist and opened a direct Vox channel on the Imperial frequency that Sithachos' distress beacon had been using. I identified myself by rank and name. I told him I had come from the Imperium. I told him I was here to bring him home. The singing stopped. The silence that followed was so abrupt and so complete that it seemed to change the physical properties of the gallery, as though the hymn had been structurally load-bearing and its removal created an instability. For 2 seconds, 3 seconds, Sithachos was motionless. The Canoptech wraiths halted their circling. Even the subthreshold trembling of the sarcophagi seemed to pause. Then the Vox unit crackled and a voice came through. It was a human voice, or had been one. 3 centuries in a machine chassis had filtered out everything in it that was biologically immediate, the warmth, the variation, the unconscious microrhythms of breath and pulse that make a voice recognizably alive, and left something that was technically functional but emotionally alien. Deep, regular. The voice of a man speaking through stone. What is the date? Not a question. A demand for a data point. A system request. I told him. The silence that followed the date was different from the previous silence. The previous silence had been suspension. This one was processing. I could hear it, not literally but perceptually, the way you can sometimes detect cognition in another being by the quality of their stillness. Something in Sithachos was receiving and integrating information that had been absent for 300 years, and the integration was not occurring smoothly, because nothing about what had happened to him was smooth. I have been inside, he said. For 300 years. Yes, I said. Another silence. Then, and no one came before now. It was not an accusation. The vocal modulation was entirely flat, entirely without the emotional coloration of accusation. It was a factual inquiry, phrased in the grammatical structure of a statement as though the declarative form created a smaller wound than the interrogative. It was the question of a man trying to understand a data set rather than trying to assign blame. And somehow that made it infinitely worse than blame would have been. No, I said. No one came before now. The contemptor chassis turned. Slowly. With the deliberate articulation of a being that had learned, over centuries of confined existence, to govern its movements precisely because the consequences of imprecision in an enclosed space were compounding. Sithachos faced me fully. His eye lenses were damaged, the left one occluded, the right one still functional but filmed with accumulated tomb dust and the residue of 300 years of combat discharge. He could not see me clearly, but he saw enough. The gold of my armor registered in whatever visual processing remained to him, and something shifted in the carriage of his chassis, not dramatically, not with the weight of a revelation, but with the small, specific adjustment of a soldier who has been running alone for a very long time and has just perceived the outline of a friendly position on a distant ridge. Golden one, he said. Yes, I said. I kept the position, he said. I held what I was told to hold. I had no answer for that. For the first time in 473 years of service, I stood before a statement and had absolutely no answer for it. Not because the statement was incomprehensible, because it was perfectly comprehensible, and the comprehension was a kind of devastation. I said, I know, brother. The wraiths had resumed their circling, but further out now and slower. In the green luminescence of the awakening gallery, in the growing tremor of 10,000 sarcophagi approaching activation, I stood 3 meters from the most catastrophic proof of institutional abandonment I had ever witnessed and tried to remember what I had come to do. The word silence sat at the back of my throat like cold metal. The gallery began its activation cycle 20 minutes after I made contact with Sithachos. I say began as though activation was a discrete event with a precise commencement point, but Necron Tomb Awakening is not a beginning, it is an arrival. The processes that culminate in it have been underway for hours or days before any single observable threshold is crossed, and by the time you can identify the arrival, the momentum behind it is already too advanced for reversal by any means available to 6 custodians in a hostile subsurface environment. What I witnessed at the 20-minute mark was not the start of something. It was the surface manifestation of something that had been building since Sathacho's broadcast his first note. The sarcophagi opened. Not all of them simultaneously. The operational logic of a Necron awakening is staged, with the hierarchy activating in descending order of command priority, the highest rank entities emerging first and confirming operational parameters before the lower tiers were released. But in a gallery of this scale, even a tiered awakening produced a visual and acoustic spectacle of extraordinary intensity. The capsule lids folded back in synchronized segments, each one revealing the interior in a cascade of green light, each interior occupied by a figure that had been motionless for 60 million years and was now executing the precise, deliberate movements of a being returning to a state it had never entirely abandoned. They stood, one after another, in ranks extending beyond visual range. Warriors first, tall, skeletal, their living metal frames moving with the uncanny fluidity of engineering that had no equivalent in human manufacture. Their eyes lit with the cold phosphorescence I had observed in dormancy, but brighter now, brighter and more focused, the difference between a candle guttering in its socket and a candle burning cleanly in still air. They stood and they oriented and they waited. For orders. For context. For the hierarchical signal that would tell them what their current operational situation required of them. The signal came in the form of a resonance that passed through every material surface in the gallery simultaneously. Floor, walls, capsules, the bodies of the newly awakened warriors themselves. Not sound in the acoustic sense. Something more fundamental. A vibration at the level of molecular structure, propagating through the living metal of every Necron construct present as a message encoded at the material level, in a language for which no human translation exists and whose semantic content I could only infer from the behavioral responses it generated. The warriors turned toward us. Not all of them. Not immediately. The closest rank, perhaps 40 warriors at a distance of 30 meters, oriented in our direction with the synchronized precision of a single organism that happened to be distributed across 40 separate bodies. Their weapons rose. Gauss flares, the signature disintegration weaponry of the Necron legions, capable of stripping matter from a target layer by layer with hideous efficiency, came to ready position with a sound like the entire electromagnetic spectrum humming on a single frequency. My team responded without instruction, Pyralis and Erevan forward, the Pale and Havelock anchoring the flanks, Sorin taking the elevated position on a sarcophagus tier. Guardian spears charged, storm shields raised, the specific combat configuration we had drilled for mass engagement in enclosed architecture. We were prepared for this fight in every tactical sense. We would lose it. Not immediately. Not in the first engagement and possibly not in the second. Custodians do not die easily, and the calculus of a custodian kill team against infantry-grade Necron warriors, even in significant numbers, was not straightforwardly unfavorable. We had faced Necron legions before in adverse conditions and extracted successfully. But not from the center of a gallery the size of a continent, surrounded by 10,000 activation capsules, with the command-grade resonance of an awakening overlord propagating through the stone beneath our feet. This was different from every engagement in my record. I felt it in the probability space, that specific cognitive phenomenon that custodians rarely discuss but all experience. The moment when tactical assessment resolves into certainty of outcome, and the certainty is terminal. Sathachos, I said, opening the Vox channel without looking away from the advancing warriors. The Dreadnought had not moved since our exchange. He stood where he had stood, and the advancing Necrons had given him a wide berth in their orientation. Not ignoring him, not attacking him, but accommodating him in their tactical deployment as though his position were a fixed geographic feature rather than a mobile combatant. As though they had done this many times before, and his location in the gallery was as established and expected as any sarcophagus row. 300 years. They had organized around him. I hear you, Golden One, Sathachos said. I need you to move with us. Toward the primary corridor. Can you do that? A pause. Longer than computational processing would require. The pause of a mind consulting memories that had been cycling in isolation for centuries, cross-referencing new information against internal models that had been built in the absence of any external correction. The corridor, he said. I know the corridor. I have been there many times. Yes, I said. Take us there. He moved. And as he moved, something happened that none of my tactical modeling had accounted for. The warriors stopped. Not in retreat. Not in reconfiguration. They stopped in the way that a process stops when it receives a command from a higher authority that supersedes its current instruction. Weapons remained at ready. Eyes tracked, but the forward movement ceased, and the gallery went from kinetic to static in the span of a single heartbeat, and the silence that followed was a different kind of silence from the natural silence of the dead stone. This silence was a decision. Someone had decided to let us walk. I wanted to call it mercy. I knew it was not. Mercy implies emotional investment in the well-being of the recipient. What had stopped the warriors was not mercy. It was interest. We were being permitted to proceed not because our lives had value to whatever intelligence had issued the halt order, but because our behavior in the seconds ahead was information that intelligence wished to collect. We were moving through the tomb on the sufferance of something that wanted to see where we would go. I did not share this analysis with my team. They had almost certainly arrived at the same conclusion independently. We were custodians. We did not require one another's conclusions to reach our own. We followed Sithachos through the gallery. Behind us, the warriors watched in silence, weapons raised, 10,000 pairs of cold eyes tracking our departure with the patient attention of entities that had learned, 60 million years ago, that patience was the only currency that never depreciated. Nemecath the Undying made no dramatic entrance. I had half expected, from the scale of what his presence implied, from the resonance his awakening had sent through every material surface in the tomb, something commensurate with his authority. A revelation, a descent from some elevated architectural position, preceded by the luminous displays that high-ranking Necron lords sometimes employed as both communication and intimidation, their living metal bodies augmented with energy conduits that could generate light in spectra no biological I was designed to receive without damage. Instead, he was simply present where he had not been before. At the terminus of the corridor Sithachos led us through, a broader passage than those of the outer tier, its walls inlaid with script in the Necronter language that I recognized from intelligence profiles as high-rank dynastic record, the genealogy and conquest ledger of the dynasty inscribed in materials whose longevity put any human monument to shame. Nemecath stood in the center of the corridor with an absolute, unceremonious stillness that was more imposing than any theatrical approach could have been. He was tall, taller than the standard Necron warrior by a margin that communicated rank as efficiently as any heraldic display. His living metal frame bore the complex augmentations of an overlord. Resonance architecture built into his thoracic structure, staff of light held at the ready, crown-like protrusions framing a face whose features had been sculpted with fine detail into the metal at the time of his biotransference, capturing a likeness of the flesh he had abandoned 60 million years before he would stand before me. His eyes were gold. Not the cold green of the warriors. Gold. A warm, impossibly deep gold that seemed less like a luminescent source and more like something preserved. A color that had been carried forward through 60 million years of sleep as the last remnant of a biological palate the rest of him had surrendered. He did not speak immediately. He looked at Sithachos. For a long time, he simply looked at Sithachos, with an attention so complete and so focused that it seemed less like observation and more like recognition. The kind of recognition that operates below the threshold of surprise, because the thing being recognized is something already known, something expected, a data point that merely required physical confirmation to complete a theory 60 million years in development. Then he spoke. The language was Necronter native, but my helm possessed translation architecture capable of rendering it, imperfectly, with the inevitable losses that attend any translation between modes of cognition as fundamentally divergent as Necronter and human, but adequately enough to follow the semantic content. His voice was not what I had anticipated. I had anticipated the cold, processual tones of an intelligence that had been architectural scale machinery for longer than human civilization had existed. I received instead something that carried the residue of something older, a voice that remembered, somewhere below its mechanical surface, the acoustics of biological speech. "You are," he said, "the one who came for it." I noted the pronoun. Not him. Not the warrior. A Necron overlord who had been present, in some form, through some fragment of consciousness, for 3 centuries of Sithachos' vigil, and who had arrived at a categorization that the Imperium itself had not quite managed. "I came for him," I said, emphasizing the correction with deliberate clarity. Nemecath's golden eyes shifted to me. Something moved in them, not emotionally, not in any human sense, but something processed. A distinction was examined. "Him," he repeated, in a tone that was neither agreement nor argument. An experiment with the pronoun, as though testing whether it changed anything. "His name is Sathachos," I said. "He has been your prisoner for 3 centuries. "He has not been our prisoner," Nemecath said, and the precision of the correction was something I could not simply dismiss. "We did not imprison him. We sealed our tomb when the intrusion was detected, and he was inside. We sealed our tomb around him, not against him. The distinction is one your kind rarely makes, but it is not trivial." I did not argue the distinction. He was technically correct, and arguing the technical points of Necron culpability for Sathachos' condition was not relevant to the mission. What I was listening for was something beneath the words, the operational logic, the governing priority that had caused a fully activated Necron overlord to stand in a corridor and engage in discourse rather than direct his legions to annihilate 6 intruders and 1 damaged dreadnought. "Why are you talking to me?" I asked, directly, without diplomatic ornamentation. The Adeptus Custodes have no particular obligation to diplomatic convention with Xenos. "Because," Nemecath said, "I have been watching this one fight for 300 years, and I have a question." He did not look at me when he said it. He was still looking at Sathachos, who had not moved, who was standing in the corridor with the quiet, terrible patience of a being that had exhausted the internal resources required for anything more dynamic than standing and waiting. "Then ask it," I said. Nemecath turned his golden eyes back to me. "What does your god?" he said. "Oh, it's dead." The question arrived in me like a structural event. Not a thought, not an emotion, but something that preceded both. The kind of impact that reconfigures internal architecture before the conscious mind can catalog the damage. I had walked into this tomb with the silence, if necessary, instruction at the center of my mission, and the trajectory of everything had been moving toward the execution of that instruction with the cold efficiency of the Emperor's finest instrument. The question did not reverse that trajectory, but it opened something alongside it, a parallel space in which the question could exist and insist on being answered, whether or not the answer was convenient. "That question is not yours to ask," I said, because it was the answer my function demanded. "No," Nemecath said. "It is his. I am merely asking it in his place, because he does not yet have the capacity to ask it of you in language you would recognize." He gestured toward Sathachos with one hand, the precise, economical gesture of an intelligence accustomed to communicating in minimal signal. "I have been watching him break for 3 centuries, Nemecath said. "I know what it looks like, the dissolution of a mind inside a machine that will not let it die. I know it with the expertise of someone who has administered it to 60 million of my own kind. What I did not anticipate was finding a specimen of your design interred within my walls, demonstrating the same process, inflicted by the same mechanism, except that yours was not a transaction. No one offered him immortality. No one asked for his consent. He was merely placed inside the machine and left. Tell me, Golden One, in your 60 million years of existence, 473 years, I said, in whatever span of existence your architecture has sustained, have you encountered anything more honest than what this one is? Sathachos made a sound. Low, subvocal. Not the hymn. The hymn was silent now, had been silent since we found him. This was different. A resonance in the chassis subsystems, a vibration in the mechanical structure that a different century might have called a sigh. I looked at Sathachos for a long time. Then I said, "No." Sathachos spoke in the corridor of Nemecath's tomb while I listened, and the Xenos Lord stood in gold-eyed stillness beside us, and the 10,000 warriors of his legion waited in the gallery behind sealed doors, and the tomb continued its slow, inexorable advance toward full activation, and the universe did not pause or dim or provide any ceremonial acknowledgement of the fact that something important was being said. It never does. In my 473 years, I have observed that the universe has no interest in marking its significant moments with appropriate atmospheric weight. The most devastating conversations happen in corridors, in the middle of operational contexts, surrounded by the bureaucratic clutter of active crisis. The truth does not wait for suitable conditions. It emerges when the pressure builds past containment, and the containment of Sithachos had been building for 300 years. He spoke in fragments. Not because his vocabulary was diminished. The Contemptor chassis had preserved the full linguistic architecture of the mind interred within it, and Sithachos had been a scholar of considerable depth before his wounding, as the chapter records that I had been briefed on confirmed. He spoke in fragments because the internal architecture of a mind that has been cycling in isolation for 3 centuries develops around its own orbits, and linear speech requires a relationship with external time that Sithachos had not possessed for 300 years. He spoke in the order that memory surfaced, not in the order that narrative preferred. He remembered the descent, the Sable Eternals entering the outer chambers, the artifact extraction proceeding without incident, the first engagement with canoptech constructs at the inner threshold. He remembered the order to withdraw. He remembered taking the rearguard position voluntarily without being assigned it, because a Dreadnought moves more slowly than Astartes on foot and the calculation of coverage was obvious. He remembered the corridor. He remembered the door closing. He remembered the silence after the door. I called on the Vox, he said. For a long time, many days, perhaps many weeks. There was no response, but the channel remained active. I could hear the carrier noise that indicates an open frequency. I spoke into it. I sang into it. I reasoned that if the channel was open, someone might eventually respond. No one had responded because the carrier noise he could hear was his own echo, reflecting from the tomb's internal electromagnetic environment. The Sable Eternals had not received his transmissions. They had not known he was calling. Or if they had known, they had made a determination that the operational calculus did not support a return mission, and they had sealed the incident in their records and moved on. I did not tell him this. Then I counted time, he said, by the cycling of my power cells, by the maintenance notifications of my chassis systems. I kept records internally, dates, durations, the number of constructs destroyed and restored, the number of corridors walked. I maintained an operational log in the format that my chapter required of all active warriors. A pause. The chassis hummed. The log has 812,000 entries. 812,000 daily operational reports. Filed to no command network. Transmitted to no Mechanicus oversight system. Written into an internal archive that had never been accessed, that might never be accessed, the compulsive administrative behavior of a warrior whose identity was so thoroughly constituted by his role as a recorder of service that he had continued recording even when there was no one to receive the record. The universe felt very heavy in that moment. Did you know, he said, with the flat, affectless delivery of a being asking a factual question about a matter that had ceased to generate emotional response through sheer repetitive exposure, that this one, and here the chassis made a movement that I interpreted with some difficulty as indicating Nemecath, spoke to me. Once. I looked at Nemecath, the Overlord's expression, to the extent that a face of living metal could be said to express anything, was one of confirmation. Neither admission nor apology. Simply yes. When? I asked. 40 years after the door closed, Sithachos said. I had been here 40 years. He came to this corridor and he stood before me and he said, through some translation mechanism I did not understand and could not confirm was functioning accurately, he said, I know what you are. I know what was done to you. I know the weight of the machine. I turned fully to face Nemecath. That is all, I said. I offered to end it, Nemecath said. Not defensively, not apologetically, as a datum. I communicated the capability and the willingness. He declined. I declined, Sithachos confirmed. Why? I asked. And here Sithachos paused for longer than any of his previous pauses. Longer than the pause after I told him the date. Longer than the pause when he processed the recognition of my golden armor. A pause that felt like excavation. Like something being recovered from a depth at which pressure had compressed it into a form requiring decompression before it could be spoken. Because, he said, if I died in here, no one would ever know I tried. There it was. The foundation of 3 centuries. Not duty, precisely, duty had been exhausted long before the first century ended. burned away in the repetitive futility of a war against an enemy that could not be permanently defeated. Not faith, not the theological structures that sustained ordinary human soldiers through hardship, because faith of that kind requires a perceived relationship with its object, and the Emperor's silence to Sithachos had been as absolute as the tombs. Not hope, because hope requires the possibility of a specific better outcome, and the specific better outcome that Sithachos might reasonably have hoped for, rescue, extraction, return to service, had become increasingly implausible with each decade. What had sustained him was simpler and more devastating than any of those things. He needed to be witnessed. He needed someone to know that he had not stopped, that he had been sealed into a 60-million-year-old tomb with no communication, no reinforcement, no supply, no direction, no acknowledgement of his existence from the institution whose interests he was serving, and he had kept going. He had maintained the position. He had filed the reports. He had sung the hymns. He had needed someone to come and see that, and he had remained alive to receive that witness because dying without it would have made the 3 centuries a silence. I could feel the weight of the silence, if necessary order, in a way that differed qualitatively from how I had felt it before entering the tomb. Before, it had been a contingency, a tactical option held in reserve against the possibility that the asset was unrecoverable. Now it was something else. Now it was a sentence, and I was its designated executor, standing before the condemned, and the condemned had just told me that the thing they had preserved themselves to receive was exactly what I had delivered by arriving. I had already discharged the mission's most important function simply by being here. Whether I then killed him was almost secondary. Almost. Custodian, Nemekath said. I hear you, I said, without looking away from Sithachos. The activation threshold will be reached within 4 hours, he said. When it is reached, the full operational capacity of this tomb will be engaged, and the operational priority of this tomb, as with all tombs of my dynasty, will be the elimination of all active biological presences within its architecture, followed by assessment of external threats, followed by planetary surface emergence in force. A pause. Your arrival has done more to accelerate that timeline than his 3 centuries of presence. Your signal, your equipment, your biological presence in the deeper tiers. I know, I said. Then you know, he said, that you have until the threshold to make whatever choice you came here to make. There is a quality to impossible choices that distinguishes them from merely difficult ones. The impossible choice does not offer a pathway to an acceptable outcome. Every option within it leads somewhere that cannot be called good, and the selection between them is not the selection of the better path but the navigation of degrees of irreversible wrong. Difficult choices can be optimized. Impossible choices can only be survived. Nemekath's framing of the situation had the architectural clarity of a mind that had spent 60 million years constructing and executing strategic calculi. He had not given me an ultimatum with the emotional texture of a threat. He had given me a systems description, the operational parameters of his tomb's awakening, stated as facts rather than conditions, in the manner of an intelligence that considered the distinction between fact and condition to be one of perspective rather than ontology. The facts did not change based on what I chose. The tomb would reach activation threshold in approximately 4 hours. At activation threshold, biological elimination would become its primary operational directive. What changed based on my choice was only what I carried away from the tomb and what I left inside it. Option 1. I silenced Sithachos. His signal, the electromagnetic signature of his active systems, the broadcast of his distress beacon, the carrier wave emission of his ongoing operation, is what has triggered and sustained the tomb's accelerating awakening. Without the signal, the activation index drops. The tomb does not halt, it is already too far advanced for that, but it decelerates. The hierarchy resets to standard dormancy assessment protocols. The full activation threshold is pushed back by years, potentially decades. We extract. The Sable Eternals mourn a second time. I carry the weight of what I have done, which is the execution of a warrior who held his position for 300 years and asked for nothing but witness. And the Imperium is never informed that it happened, because classified operations at this tier are managed through documentation protocols that ensure their details do not proliferate beyond the minimum necessary circle. Option 2. I extract Sithachos. His chassis is still mobile, still functional in its fundamental architecture. The extraction route is 3 kilometers through increasingly active Necron architecture. The probability of a successful extraction, 6 custodians and 1 damaged Dreadnought fighting their way out of an awakening tomb against a garrison that Nemekath has just informed me numbers in excess of 47,000 warriors, plus canoptech support elements, plus whatever Overlord-grade entities the dynasty's command structure had deployed to this world before the Great Sleep, is not something I could calculate precisely, but I could estimate it, and the estimate was not comforting. Beyond the probability of our survival, there was the question of strategic consequence. A fully activated Necron tomb world in this subsector, its strategic priorities fully engaged, would constitute an existential threat to 7 populated Imperial worlds within strike range. The calculus of lives was not difficult to run. 47,000 Necron warriors fully operational against 7 worlds whose combined population exceeded 12 billion. Sathachos against 12 billion. Option 2 was not actually an option. I knew it the moment Nemekath finished his statement. The math was not the kind of mathematics that required extended deliberation. It was the kind that presents itself in full at first contact and then waits for the conscious mind to stop arguing with it. I knew what I had to do. I hated that I knew. Tell me something, I said to Nemekath. My voice was level. I had ensured it was level before I opened my mouth because level was what the situation required and what the custodian training had prepared me to produce in conditions of operational extremity. You said you offered to end it 40 years into his imprisonment. He refused. You have been watching him for 3 centuries. You could have ended it at any point after that refusal. Your legions have been continuously active in maintenance capacity. You have had access to him at all times. Why didn't you? The golden eyes regarded me. The same reason you are asking the question instead of simply executing your order, Nemekath said. I breathed. In the sealed environment of my helmet, the breath had nowhere to go except back to me. I breathed it back. He is not equivalent to your kind, I said. He is not a Necronter warrior who consented to biotransference. He is not a being who traded biological existence for mechanical immortality by choice. The comparison you are drawing is specious. The comparison I am drawing, Nemekath said, is one of condition rather than cause. I hold no position on whether the condition was chosen or imposed. I observe that the condition exists, that its effects are identical regardless of origin, and that in 300 years of observation I have found in this one warrior a quality that I have found in almost none of my own kind during the 60 million years of their mechanical existence. What quality? I asked. Uncorrupted purpose, Nemekath said. My kind transferred to metal and spent 60 million years in the service of entities that consumed our souls. The Tan took what we were and left behind functional processes in the shape of beings. This one, again the gesture towards Sathachos, has been in metal for 3 centuries, in conditions designed to corrupt purpose, and his purpose has not corrupted. It has simplified, reduced to its essential structure, but it has not become something other than itself. I turned to Sathachos. Brother, I said, and I used the word deliberately, knowing what it cost, knowing what followed. I need to tell you something. The chassis turned to face me. The one functional eye lens caught the green luminescence of the tomb and reflected it dully, the gold of the Sable Eternal's heraldry barely visible through the accumulated darkness of 3 centuries. Tell me, he said. I cannot extract you, I said. Not without triggering a strategic consequence that would kill billions. The chassis was still. I know, he said. You know? I have been a warrior for 900 years, he said. I know what the numbers mean. I understood the arithmetic when you said you were custodian rather than Astartes. The custodians do not come for recoveries. They come for things of a different category. Another pause. The chassis' subvocal resonance. I am glad it was one of you. I am glad it was a golden one. Something in the architecture of my certainty, the structural confidence that 473 years of absolute service had built and maintained and never permitted to crack, gave way. Not dramatically, not with any external manifestation. Internally, a fracture in a load-bearing element that had been sustaining more weight than it was designed for since the moment I first heard the hymn at the bottom of the descent shaft. I am sorry, I said. And I meant it in a way that exceeded the verbal capacity of the words I used. The Adeptus Custodes do not apologize frequently. Apology implies a recognition of inadequacy, a failure of function, and the Emperor's instruments are not designed around inadequacy. But what I felt in that moment was not the inadequacy of a failed instrument. It was something different, the recognition that the system I served was capable of creating situations in which all its instruments functioned perfectly and the outcome was still wrong. Sathachos spoke one more time before I moved. Golden One. Yes. The 812,001st entry in the operational log, he said. It reads, Contact made with Adeptus Custodes element. Shield Captain Malchin Vane, 4th Brotherhood. He came. I activated my Guardian Spear. I will not describe it in detail. Not because I lack the capacity for the description. I have recounted every significant event of my 473-year career in the fullness that the record-keeping protocols of the Adeptus Custodes require, and the Varanthos 4 incident is no exception. The complete operational file exists in the Terran Vault under 17 layers of classification, accessible only by the Captain General and the 2 members of the Collegiate Castellan whose oversight covers operations of this tier. The full account is there. Every technical detail, every tactical decision, every measurable parameter of what happened in that corridor. What I am offering here is not the record. The record is for the Vault. What I am offering here is the account that the Vault does not have, because the Vault records events and I am telling you what events feel like from inside, which is a different kind of information and one that the institutional documentation process has no architecture for. I will tell you this. It was not long. Sathachos had made his peace with it before I raised the weapon. He had made his peace with it over the course of many years of private calculation, in the operational log entries that I was never able to read in full because the internal archive of a Dreadnought chassis is proprietary to the chapter it served, and the Sable Eternals, when eventually contacted in the aftermath of the mission, provided only a single-paragraph summary of the contents, marked at the highest level of internal restriction. I know what Sathachos felt about what happened in that corridor only from the evidence of his behavior in the moments preceding it, and that evidence suggested a man who had long since moved past the emotional register of fear or resistance and into the territory of completion. He did not fight. He had no desire to fight what I was. He stood with the careful, deliberate stillness he had demonstrated throughout our encounter, and the last thing his Vox unit produced. Not the hymn, not speech, but something between them, something that my audio architecture classified as a single sustained note from the processional of undying valor, the first bar of the first verse, the verse that precedes the passage about laying down burdens, lasted for 4 seconds after the Guardian Spear discharged. Then it stopped. The silence that followed was the third qualitatively distinct silence I had encountered in Varanthos 4. The first was the geological silence of 60 million years of absence. The second was the purposeful silence of a command decision, Nemecath halting his legions. The third was the silence of something ending that had been going on for a very long time, and its particular character was one of completion rather than termination. The difference between a door closing at the end of an evening and a door closing at the end of a life. Nemecath stood where he had been standing throughout. He said nothing for a long time. Then, "Your kind calls that mercy. I don't know what we call it," I said. "No," he agreed. "I have observed that your kind rarely develops adequate language for its contradictions. Does yours? We have 60 million years of terminology for the condition of being trapped inside a machine that will not let you stop," he said. "We spent the first 10 million years developing it. We spent the next 50 million years discovering that having the terminology did not constitute having a solution. I retrieved the distress beacon, a small, dense unit housed in the Dreadnought's secondary chassis compartment, no larger than my fist, the source of the signal that had brought me here and triggered the tomb's awakening. I deactivated it. The electromagnetic signature that the tomb's sensory architecture had been responding to for the past weeks ceased. I could feel the change in the ambient resonance of the tomb immediately, a fractional reduction in the activation harmonic, the equivalent of reducing a fire's oxygen supply by a marginal amount. Not enough to extinguish it. Enough to slow it. How much time does that buy us? I asked. Statistically, Nemecath said, several decades before the activation threshold is naturally reached again. The processes are already underway. The signal was catalytic, not causative. Varanthos 4 would have awakened regardless, in time.
It may outlast the Emperor.
It will certainly outlast me.
I engaged the gunship's retrieval signal and rose from the atmospheric line into the clean, honest vacuum of space, and behind me Varanthos 4 turned in its orbit without slowing, without grief, without any acknowledgement that the event I was carrying away from it had any particular significance in the record of its 60-million-year existence. The stars did not dim. The Emperor did not speak. The war, as it always has, continued. I understand that a warrior of sufficient quality and institutional significance, whose death would constitute an irreplaceable loss to the fighting capacity of a chapter, is worth preserving in modified form. I understand that the warrior who enters the sarcophagus does so voluntarily, or as voluntarily as a being whose entire existential framework is constructed around service and sacrifice can be said to make choices about the continuation of that service. I understand all of this, and I hold none of it in question as operational policy. What I hold in question, and I have held it in question since descending that shaft, and I will hold it in question until I deliver my report to the Captain General and perhaps beyond that, for as many of my remaining years as the question continues to insist on occupancy in my cognition, is what the policy owes the practitioner, what the institution owes the instrument. Sathachos filed 812,000 operational reports to a network that was not receiving them. He sang a hymn to an emperor who was not listening, but then the emperor is not listening to any of us, and we continue to serve anyway because the choice to serve is not predicated on confirmation of the relationship. He declined Nemekatha's offer of release because he needed someone to arrive and see that he had continued. He had sustained himself through 3 centuries of isolation in a hostile environment on the basis of a narrative about himself that required a witness to complete. And the Imperium had sent the witness 49 years after the last reasonable hope of it arriving had presumably expired. Not out of mercy. Not out of the specific concern for Sathachos's condition that would have motivated a retrieval mission in the first year, the first decade. The Imperium sent me when the signal became operationally inconvenient, when the broadcast posed a strategic threat. The witness arrived not for Sathachos's sake, but for the Imperium's. He was grateful anyway. That is the part one cannot resolve. That is the structural element of this account that refuses to integrate with the rest of my functional philosophy, the gratitude. Not the 3 centuries of isolation. That is explicable in terms of operational context, priority assessment, the vast and competing demands of an Imperium fighting a war on every front simultaneously, the 1,000 legitimate reasons why a single dreadnought sealed in a Xeno's tomb might not generate sufficient urgency to compete with the other demands on a chapter's strategic resources. All of that is explicable. But the gratitude. He had been abandoned. He had maintained himself, at incalculable cost, on the hope of witness. The witness arrived nearly 3 centuries late, and then killed him. And he was grateful. The universe that produces that outcome is not a universe I can categorize as just. But it is the universe I serve, and I serve it in the name of an emperor who built the Dreadnought program and built the custodians who carry out the silencing of its casualties, and who has not commented on any of it from his throne in 10,000 years. The silence is the policy. The silence is the governance. The silence is, perhaps, the only honest statement the Emperor has made about the true nature of what he requires. He requires everything. He says thank you to no one. And the beings who gave everything to him, voluntarily, constitutionally, in the full and informed understanding of the transaction, find, when the moment of reckoning arrives, that they are grateful anyway. Grateful to be remembered. Grateful to have been seen. I am 473 years old. I have served in the most elite warrior organization in human history. I have killed demons in the Emperor's name, and traitors and Xenos, and things that existed outside the categorical frameworks of imperial theology. I have done this without ambivalence, without crisis of faith, without the existential fracturing that the Black Library's texts record in warriors of lesser engineering and shorter tenure. I have never before stood in a dead planet's upper atmosphere and found that I lacked an answer to a question. I find now that I lack one. I will return to Terra. I will file the vault report. I will receive the Captain General's acknowledgement and return to my post, and the Varanthos 4 incident will become a classified entry in the operational record of the Fourth Brotherhood, and the Sable Eternals will be given a summary notification through channels that provide enough information for institutional closure, without enough information for institutional reckoning. The tomb will continue its slow advance toward awakening in the decades ahead, and at some point in the future a mission will be necessary to address that strategic fact, and the warriors dispatched on that mission will descend a shaft into a silence that will be, by then, 60 million years plus several decades old. They will not find a hymn waiting for them. The galaxy turns. The stars do not answer the questions we press against them. The Emperor's throne hums with the energy of 10,000 souls consumed in his service per day, and from it comes no guidance, no instruction, and no comment on the question of what he owes the dead who served him. Perhaps the silence is the answer. Perhaps the answer is nothing. I owe you nothing. Service is its own reward and its own completion, and the question of debt between the god and the instrument is a question the instrument must answer for itself, because the god has other considerations. Perhaps the answer is everything. I owe you everything, and I am in no condition to pay it, and the gap between what I owe and what I can render is the wound at the center of the Imperium, and it has always been there, and it will always be there, and you will serve anyway because the alternative is worse. I do not know which answer is correct. I know that Sathachos held his position. I know that he did not need to understand the debt or its settlement to continue holding it. I know that when I told him I had come, he said, I kept the position. I know that I was not able to bring him home. I know that 42 kilometers below me, in the stone of a dead world, a Necron overlord with gold eyes is updating a dynastic archive that will last until the last stars burn to nothing, and somewhere in that archive there is an entry about a warrior of humanity who held his post for 300 years in the dark and asked for nothing but witness, and the witness came, and it was not enough, and he was grateful for it anyway. That entry will outlast the Imperium.
Then you already knew it was temporary, I said. I have been dormant for 60 million years, he said. I have a developed capacity for the appreciation of temporary states. I signaled my team on the closed channel. They materialized from the corridor positions they had maintained throughout the exchange. The Pales positioning near the junction, Havelock at the primary access point, Pyralis holding the approach from the gallery. No one spoke. They read what had happened in the chamber with the perceptual acuity of warriors who had learned to read all available information channels simultaneously, and none of them required verbal confirmation. We moved toward the extraction route. Nemekath made no effort to stop us. His legions, at the boundaries of the gallery, watched with 47,000 cold phosphorescent eyes but maintained their halt. Whatever the Overlord's reasoning had been for that, and I had not asked for a full explication, and he had not offered one, it held through our departure. At the threshold of the inner corridor, I stopped and turned back. What will you do when you fully awaken? I said. Nemekath considered the question with the thoroughness it deserved. What we always do, he said. We will reclaim what was ours. We will restore our dynasty. We will find the Silent King's edict and determine whether we still consent to its terms. A pause. And I will carry forward the record of this encounter in the dynastic archive, as I carry forward all significant observations from this period of dormancy. He looked at the place where Sathachos had been. He will have an entry. What will it say? That he held his position, Nemekath said. For 300 years, in conditions that would have dissolved any lesser form of purpose. He held his position. That is not nothing. In 60 million years, I have encountered very little that I would describe as not nothing. I said nothing. I walked out of the tomb of Varanthos 4 with 5 custodians at my back and a distress beacon in my gauntlet, and I did not look behind me at the green light growing in the gallery, or at the sound that began again somewhere below the threshold of hearing as the tomb resumed its patient, geological progress toward the hour of its next awakening. I walked through 3 kilometers of Necronter corridor in silence. No one sang. The atmosphere of Varanthos 4 ends at approximately 42 kilometers above its surface. A thin boundary layer that separates the dead planet from the indifferent vacuum, the last technical argument for the distinction between here and the void. The line is not dramatic. It is gradual, a fading of faint atmospheric haze into the absolute clarity of deep space, the stars sharpening from dim suggestions into the precise, unfeeling points of light that have served human navigation and human theology and human despair in roughly equal measure across the duration of civilization. I stood at that line. The gunship that had brought us into the system was holding station 400 kilometers above the planet's surface, waiting for extraction. My 5 custodians were aboard. The mission was complete in every measurable parameter. The distress beacon was in my possession, deactivated. The asset had been silenced as per the contingency order. The activation timeline of the Varanthos 4 tomb had been decelerated by decades. The strategic threat to the 7 inhabited worlds of the subsector had been reduced to a theoretical future problem rather than an immediate operational crisis. By every metric the mission brief had offered, the operation was a success. I had been standing at the atmospheric line for 20 minutes, which was approximately 19 minutes longer than any operational necessity required. The Emperor's silence is one of the enduring conditions of imperial existence that I have never resolved to my satisfaction, in 473 years of attempting resolution. He sits on the golden throne, sustained by psychic energy that must be fed to him in a continuous stream of sacrificed souls. The 10,000 souls per day that the black ships collect from across the galaxy and bring to Terra to burn in his service, and he does not speak. He has not spoken since the Primarchs were scattered, since the heresy broke the Imperium in half, since the wound that Horus inflicted was bound into a sarcophagus of gold and machinery, and the great project of humanity's survival was handed to hands that have done their imperfect best with it for 10 millennia. He does not speak. I have never required him to speak to maintain my loyalty. My loyalty is constitutional, built into the architecture of what I am at a level deeper than conscious choice, not because choice was removed from me but because the choice was made so completely and so early in my development that it became the medium through which all subsequent choices were made. I am loyal to the Emperor as a river is loyal to gravity. The metaphor is not degrading. It is descriptive. But in the corridor of Nemecath's tomb, the question had been asked, and it had been asked by something that had 60 million years of expertise in the specific subject of the question, and it had been asked in front of a being who was the most qualified witness to its necessity that the universe could have arranged, and I had no answer. What does your god owe its dead? I understand the instrumental logic of the Dreadnought program.